Okay, welcome back. Last show, I left off talking about Herman Kahn. As I said before, if you want to meet an interesting person, Kahn is your man. I promise I'm going to do a short on him in the future. Definitely his tie with Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove is worth a short. Also, Savage Continent has a YouTube channel, which literally just went live like today as of this recording. So if you want to tell someone about the show, now they can just simply Google Savage Continent Podcast and they will find the YouTube channel. And from they can either stream the show from there, or there are links to our iTunes or our Spotify or Google Podcasts or any of that. So last time we got to meet two new leaders, Dwight Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev. And I like to think of them both as gamblers. You have your one card counter that likes to play the odds and loves calculated risk. And then you have your sort of chips forward gambler type gambler. You'd like to think that in the long run, the first is likely to be most successful, and of course you'd be right, but that's something that occurs over the course of time. And then even the best gamblers can have losing streaks that nearly wipe them out. Sometimes the irrational, emotional gambler walks home with a fortune. Now, when you're talking about the situation at this point in the Cold War, it seems the United States is sort of the odds favorite, but then again, sometimes your long shots win, don't they? In our nuclear game of chance, we're about to see one of these players push all of their chips forward. And another player is actually leaving the table. Dwight Eisenhower is going to be term limited out by 1960, and his replacement looks mighty green. John F. Kennedy has not been in politics long. If it wasn't for his father's money and influence, it's doubtful he'd even be there at all. Compare that to Nikita Khrushchev, and we talked about Khrushchev last time. He's sort of a communist, sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of success story. Remember, he was literally shoveling poop at one point. This was a man who had calluses on his hands. I can't see Kennedy ever having any types of calluses, unless you count like from golf or tennis. If you're Khrushchev, you have to think of this guy as someone that you would be willing to take a risk against. Today we're going to see how both of these men square off in a battle of wits that will involve a third player that none of them appreciated or even understood. They'd have no idea going in, but the world would come closer to nuclear war at this moment than any in world history. You probably heard this story, but you most likely haven't heard the whole story. Today we'll learn about the most dangerous period in the history of the modern world, and of course, the U.S. plan that would have brought everything crashing down. This time on Savage Continent. So let's talk again about the first national unified, overall real war plan, a war plan that would kick into gear at a moment's notice. This has not happened before. What Eisenhower is engineering with the SIOP is almost entirely new in our history. When it comes to nuclear weapons, Truman and Eisenhower at least nominally placed decision-making for how to fight a nuclear war in the hands of the Air Force, and particular Strategic Air Command. But the Navy and the Army have also acquired their own weapons during the latter part of the 1950s. For the most part, these are small tactical weapons for use on the battlefield. For the Army, they'd get as small as the Davy Crockett. I think I mentioned that in the first episode. It's a half kiloton warhead shot via a bazooka. It would go for half a mile. It's questionable whether the person firing this bazooka would end up getting irradiated. It probably would depend on what way the wind was blowing. It would probably be a weapon of last resort. I mean, I certainly wouldn't get involved in it. Meanwhile, the Navy is going to start accumulating a few small devices that can fit under the wings of jets, that can lift off a carrier. The president, of course, still has final say if they can be used or not, but each service can make its own decision about what exactly to do with them. If you're Thomas Power or Curtis LeMay, you still believe that you have near complete control over the strategic bombs and warheads, the ones that really matter, the big ones. The top Air Force commanders still endorse what's going to be called the Sunday Punch, this big giant shoot everything off war plan to just, blow the doors off the Soviet Union. Although they do take input given to them by the nerds at RAND at times, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson, fearing that too many branches of the military were getting nukes, decided to limit the Army missiles with a radius of about 200 miles. And also they could use surface-to-air defense missiles. But the Navy, still hampered by the size of the weapons that could go under a carrier, wasn't really a rival to Thomas Power, Curtis LeMay, and the Air Force until the Polaris. So for one, these new missiles are going to use solid fuel, which is apparently much more stable than the earlier missiles, which you'd have to use this weird volatile mixture of liquid oxygen that has to be kept near absolute zero, and then petrochemicals, and then they have to be sort of combined together and then put in the missile, and that takes time, and it's potentially dangerous. Solid fuel, on the other hand, you can just sort of store it, and it's kind of ready to go whenever. And then, more importantly, and please just follow me here, these new Polaris missiles can be fired from this brand new thing, a nuclear-powered submarine. Yes, a nuclear-powered submarine. This is absolutely huge. These things can stay underwater indefinitely. They are almost impossible to detect when they're submerged. In 1959, one U.S. sub popped through the ice at the North Pole. The Navy knew it was onto something, big time. So remember how there was that revolt of the admirals back in 1949, where you have all these top Navy brass, and they're kind of testifying how horrible atomic weapons are, and they're killing women and children, and Well, guess what? All of that out the window. These guys love atomic weapons now. Wouldn't you know it? Kaplan writes, quote, "Then in 1951, the Navy started to assemble its own atomic arsenal. Suddenly, only a few years after the Admiral's revolt, the atomic bomb was no longer barbaric. Some naval officers began to argue along Air Force lines that atomic bombs should be used at the outset of the conflict. Admiral Radford, as Eisenhower's Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman suddenly became the most vociferous proponent of massive retaliation. End quote. So that's that same Admiral Radford that said a, quote, war of annihilation might bring a Pyrrhic military victory, but would also be politically and economically senseless. So, yeah, I mean, isn't it just funny how all of a sudden when the Navy gets the toys that it wants, it just totally changes its opinion. Yeah, kind of makes you think the worst about humanity, doesn't it? Okay, back to Kaplan here. Quote, each Polaris could hold 16 nuclear missiles. Not only could the subs move continuously, but they could do so underwater, making them virtually impossible to detect or track. And by this time, due in no small part to Wohlstetter and Hoffman's RAND studies, the Air Force was coming to recognize the vulnerability of its SAC air bases. The Polaris was something the Navy could stab at the very heart of the Air Force operations and budgets. By 1958, the Polaris project looked technically feasible. A solid fuel missile had been developed. An underwater missile launch system had been demonstrated. One Navy captain told an Air Force friend, Colonel Richard Yudkin, Assistant Director of Air Force Plans, quote, we've got something that's going to put you guys out of business. So now, while the Air Force and the Army would always have to sort of fret about its bombers and missiles being sort of blasted to smithereens by a surprise attack, the Navy had this new foolproof plan to ride out any enemy first strike and then deliver a crippling counterstrike. I mean, there was nothing the enemy could do about it. SAC's only solution was just to build more and more and more missiles and bombers, but maybe put them in hardened silos, which may or may not survive. I mean, how expensive would that be? I mean, why don't you just build a bunch of these submarines and you're golden, right? So now if you're LeMay or Tommy Power, you're about to wet your pants. I mean, like, what do? I mean, okay, let's go see if those RAND nerds we've been intentionally yawning and farting loudly around can maybe get us out of this jam. I don't know. Let's get them all Starbucks. So the RAND guys, I mean, they work for the Air Force. So even though, I mean, it's like they're always put upon by these people, it's kind of like working for the boss that's abusive to you, but then he's still your boss. So a few of them, they got to get together. One idea is creating, I love this idea. A gigaton bomb. No, that is a 1,000 megaton bomb. That would be a bomb. I mean, the largest bomb ever created was a 50 megaton bomb. So this would be 1,000 megaton bomb. Bruno Augenstein, this is the guy, and he didn't really come up with a ton of like other ideas. At least not that I know of, and maybe this is why. His idea is if you were to just have 10 of these gigaton bombs, then that would be like an ultimate deterrent because, I mean, oh my God, what would that even look like? I mean, how big would the blast radius on a gigaton bomb be? It's technically feasible. There's no upper limit to how large a hydrogen weapon can be, which makes them so scary. I mean, you'd have to make it, maybe you could make a giant ship into a bomb and then sail it into port. Recently, I've heard of something called a torpedo, an apocalypse torpedo. I read an article in Scientific American that, you know, I don't know what to make of this. Russia might be building one of these things. I mean, it's very feasible, but that idea didn't fly. Eventually, it's going to be William Kaufman. We remember William Kaufman with the counterforce? He came up with the idea that the Navy missiles, well, they wouldn't have the accuracy or the destructive power to destroy military targets. So he's going to write, quote, a strategic military force, primarily or totally dependent on Polaris, would increase the difficulty of defending Allied areas, particularly Western Europe. In fact, placing our bets essentially on Polaris would appear almost to invite the Soviets to engage in limited aggression. Certainly the risks would look far less against a submerged city-busting system than against a widely dispersed, protected land-based system in which appeared capable of conducting a counterforce campaign. The minimum deterrent strategy favored the Navy. In short, would hardly be a winning one, end quote. So Kaufman's solution, as he would later write, would be to concentrate SAC assets to hit military targets and then leave destruction of cities to Polaris, which couldn't be taken out in the first strike. So, you're just going to hit the military targets first and then sort of wait, leave the cities alone. And then, if the war keeps going, then just allow the submarine missiles to take care of the cities. So LeMay, and you kind of know what LeMay's thinking, he's pretty predictable. I mean, you got to like him for that at least. He dismissed it out of hand. But as he's vice chief of staff of the Air Force, Thomas White, his superior, he's interested. And that's something pretty notable since he previously just kind of went along with LeMay, and he had actually written in the Saturday Evening Post, quote, "In common with many other military men, active and retired, I am profoundly apprehensive of the pipe-smoking, tree-full-of-owls type of so-called professional defense intellectuals who have been brought into the nation's capital. I don't believe a lot of these often overconfident, sometimes arrogant young professors, mathematicians, and other theorists have sufficient worldliness or motivation to stand up to the kind of enemy that we face. War is a brutal, dirty, deadly affair. Our enemy is a coarse, crooked megalomaniac who aims to kill us. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of American strategy making today is that military influence is so disparaged by the so-called intellectuals," end quote. So the fact that these Rand guys are able to convince this guy that their ideas are workable, I mean, that really, really means something. So Rand does a war game. Of course, they assume that the Soviets are going to have 700 ICBMs and 500 long-range bombers, which is crazy. They don't really have that. But, the Air Force estimates are always going to be on the high end, because if you have super high estimates of what the enemy has and is capable of, you're going to get more toys. So they're basically going to run 3 different war games. The first one basically has the Soviet Union surprise attacking the United States. The United States attacks with everything it has in one massive counterattack. The way it games out, 150 million Americans die, 60% of industrial capacity is gone, ends up being 40 million Russians, less than 20% of their population's dead. The second one, the results are kind of similar, although a little bit better. In the second game, instead of just going after cities and urban areas, more missile silos, airfields, rail centers are attacked. It's the optimum mix strategy, but still the Russians are able to retain enough striking power to kill 110 million Americans. And then for the third, I'm going to quote Kaplan, quote, "The third scenario, the counterforce no city strategy, produced entirely different results. The Soviets attack Western Europe. Conventional forces cannot hold them. The U.S. launches a nuclear attack against the USSR, but restricts the targets of attack to bomber fields, missile pads, submarine pens, and control centers associated with the Soviet strategic rocket forces. The Soviets retaliate against the United States, but seeing that we have avoided their cities, find it in their interest to avoid ours as well. So likewise confine their attack to SAC striking forces. We mop up their remaining air defenses and strategic forces, holding some of our weapons in a reserve force. We then send a message to the Russians telling them to stop, or else we will start picking off their cities one by one. The Soviets, clearly outgunned, surrender. The war is over. Only 3 million Americans have died, and only 5 million Russians," end quote. Now, of course, some people did point out problems. So if the Soviets attack first, wouldn't we just be wasting weapons hitting empty air bases and silos? What if they go right after our cities with the surviving weapons? I mean, for this to work, you would have to strike back super fast, or there's no force left to counter. Having to act that fast also increases the risk of an accident or a miscalculation. I mean, again, think of like the gunslinger analogy where you have like the two gunslingers in the Old West movie. I mean, if you have to act so fast that you have to shoot the gun out of the other guy's hand, maybe he's not going for his gun at all, and you're going to reach down and shoot him, and he could have been doing something else. He could have been reaching into his pocket for a piece of gum or something. I mean, you just don't know. Again, and it's like, also, you're making up all of these rules, and then you're sort of assuming the other side is going to play by those rules. Anyway, Thomas White ate it up. This whole counterforce thing, it is going to keep the Air Force relevant, despite the fact that the Navy is gaining on it because of this whole like Polaris submarine thing. Afterwards, Thomas Power just exploded after hearing the decision. He was not happy at all. Now, if there is one little quote that I would love for all of you to take away from this whole little series that we've been doing, it is this one. This is classic Tommy Power right here. This is the best. I mean, if I could get this crocheted or, made into a tapestry or calligraphy, I would definitely put this up on the wall. This is the best. Okay. Quote, "Why do you want us to restrain ourselves?" Power bellowed. "Restraint. Why are you so concerned with saving their lives? The whole idea is to kill the bastards." After several minutes of this, he finally said, "Look, at the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian, we win." Kaufman, his patience exhausted, snapped back, "Well, you better make sure they're a man and a woman." End quote. At that point, Power stalked out of the room. The briefing was over. Meanwhile, Curtis LeMay would say out of the incoming Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who was a proponent of this whole counterforce thing, quote, "Why that son of a bitch was in junior high school when I was out bombing Japan," end quote. So another report came out early in 1960 that threw some cold water on the whole counterforce concept. The WSEG 50, or the Weapons System Evaluation Group, surmised that pretty much no matter what the U.S. did, there would still be enough Soviet firepower left over to deliver 1,000 to 2,000 megatons on the U.S. population. Even if shelters were built for every one of the population, at least 60 million people would die. Trying to gain some sort of counterforce advantage would also spark an arms race. Again, if there's a danger that the other side is going to disarm you by like destroying your weapons before you can launch them, I mean, it's just, why don't you just build more weapons? And then everybody's going to build more weapons. That's a drawback too. In the opinion of this report, quote, "Any effort to minimize the destructiveness of the retaliation would weaken the destructive power of the strategic arsenal," end quote. This report actually says a bunch of things that are very, very disconcerting. It surmised that if 5 locations, just 5 locations in the U.S. were hit, the White House, the Pentagon, Camp David, and a couple of these bunkers, Raven Rock and Mount Weather, it would destroy the entire command structure of the United States. Even just the first 2 would probably wipe out the military command structure. Garrett M. Graff, in his book Raven Rock, states, quote, "Hitting all the nation's major military commands and leadership sites would involve attacking just 14 installations, a devastating blow that would require just 35 Soviet ICBMs, while providing a 90% probability of destroying the entire political military command of strategic nuclear forces. Such an attack would leave almost the entire nation, nearly all of its major cities, and the entire military apparatus intact, without anyone left to guide it, no one to give orders, and no one left to negotiate with the Soviets. End quote. I mean, that's got to be the ultimate destabilizing nightmare scenario if you're one of these leaders. The idea that the other side could just come after you, take you and the people around you out, and leave everything else intact. There'd be no way to conduct the war. Now, when you are already almost at a full-blown panic that the Soviets are developing all of these ICBMs, you don't know exactly how accurate they are. I mean, this is a very realistic scenario and one that you have to prepare for. So it's right around this time that a program is going to be adopted called Looking Glass, in which Strategic Air Command will have multiple planes ready to command all of its operations from mid-air. The president, of course, is going to be in one of these planes. It will be able to fly over the United States for weeks at a time. There'll be in-flight refueling. But if that plane somehow gets shot down or something happened, there's multiple redundancy over redundancy over redundancy. The idea is that the most secure place is not on the ground anymore because these ICBMs could blow that out. But then there is the bigger, probably more important question. Could you control a nuclear war after it got started? I mean, wouldn't communication, under the best of circumstances, just break down? I mean, weren't all of these ideas about controlling escalation just a little bit pie in the sky? The Air Force is going to come up with a plan that took everything into account. If they couldn't beat the new Polaris missile, they would just co-opt it into their own unified plan. This is going to be the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan. They would do the same thing with all the nuclear weapons in the Army's arsenal as well. It was a totally centralized, unified plan. In a sense, it was an amazing achievement. The different services had always kind of worked together in some way or another, but there was never a single war plan where there was any sort of coordination on this level. So Eisenhower is going to be leaving office very soon. He knew his successor would just have nowhere near the kind of military experience he had. Nixon, had he won the presidency, I mean, he might have been able to swing it, but Kennedy, I mean, this is a kid. He's going to be way in over his head. If you're going to leave him a war plan, don't leave anything to chance. Eisenhower, on a personal level, did not have the most respect for Kennedy. He really, obviously Kennedy's like from a different party, but he really just thought this guy was just a total rank amateur. Eisenhower hated the idea of a nuclear war. He said, quote, "If nuclear war happens, there's nothing left to do but go out into the street and shoot everyone you see and shoot yourself." When he was asked how to revive the nation's economy after attack, he quipped, we won't be carrying on with government. We'll be grubbing for worms. He said, there can never be a nuclear war. There aren't enough bulldozers to scrape the bodies off the streets. So in a weird way, the war plan he's going to endorse, and he's going to endorse it without reservations. He's not going to be like, yeah, I don't like this, or maybe you should change that. No, he just signs off on the whole thing. This is going to be cataclysmic. He wants the bar to be so high that his successor just won't be able to amble into nuclear exchange without really taking some serious pause first. It's in that way, you could maybe call it sort of reverse psychology. Nonetheless, after hearing this plan, he's going to say, quote, "I was nearly scared to death," end quote. So, as I mentioned before, by 1960, each branch of the military had its own plan to use the weapons kind of allotted to them. All told, there's something like 20,000 of them. To Secretary of Defense Thomas Gates, this was absolutely nuts. Polaris is new. The thinking behind it's new. It needs to be worked in. At this point, Eisenhower is sort of sick of all the back and forth squabbling between the services. So under the advice of Thomas Gates, he gives the go-ahead for the Air Force to form a Joint Strategic Target Planning Agency, the JSTP, to create a national strategic target list. He tells Eisenhower that between the three services, it's basically a mess. If war came, it would be basically a food fight over what to do. He said that there needs to be one plan, and the Air Force should get the final say, although the Army, Navy, and the Marines, they should be able to provide some sort of input. Navy Chief Arleigh Burke was pissed, but what could he do? So again, it's like everybody hates the Air Force, but who else are you going to give the job to? So about now, you kind of get the feeling that there's this sort of a kid in a candy store mentality at SAC. It's like they have all the toys and now they're going to get to play with them. Here's the thing. The plan they come up with, they're going to provide a fairly good rationale for what they're up to, or at least at face value. Kaplan writes this: as the months transpired, there was more of the same. Everywhere SAC intelligence looked, they found targets, thus justifying their need for more weapons. They thought the Soviets would have 700 ICBMs by 1962. The Navy thought there would be only 200. The Air Force won the battle, to the extent there was one, with the result of 500 extra targets, requiring more than 500 extra weapons. Similarly, SAC listed 1,115 airfields that should be targeted. The Navy analysts found only 770. SAC also assumed a very high attrition rate for their bombers that would be destroyed on the ground, that those would be shot down by Soviet missiles and interceptors, and those that would fail to perform or miss their targets. If, subsequently, the operational alert force was only one-third the size of the total force, that meant that the total SAC bomber force would have to be tripled. Meanwhile, as Burke anticipated, most Polaris missiles were shunted off to hit surface-to-air missile sites or wasted on targets they had scant chance of destroying alone. End quote. So eventually, and this is after a good deal of argument and compromise, but it's sort of decided that there were 7 targets that had to be destroyed with a 97% assurance, 213 targets with a 95% assurance. There's going to be 592 with a 90% assurance, 715 with an 80%. You're going to need multiple weapons to destroy the same target because there's a lot of things that could possibly go wrong. How well defended is that target? Is the bomb going to be a dud? There's so many different reasons they're going to come up with to hit the same thing multiple times. But then think about it this way. We live in an age where a drone can hit a guy's dinner plate, while someone on the other side of the world fiddles with a joystick. I mean, back then, you don't have any of that. You'd think that these ballistic missiles are guided all the way to the target, but they're not. I mean, controlled flight lasts only for about a minute or two. For the rest of its half-hour flight, all the inertia, it's basically all just inertia and gravity. Tapes would have to be manually inserted into the guidance system to tell a missile where to go. So a typical a ballistic missile had a 38 to 75% chance of destroying its target, but an aircraft had an 81 to 95% chance if they reach the target. Of course, that's a big if. You know, as the infamous shoot-down of Gary Powers' U-2 in May 1960 showed, a bomber on its way to the target was a big if. I mean, some Air Force estimates had only 50% of the planes surviving. So, you need to send more, obviously. Then how far can you expect your bombs and missiles to land from their target? According to estimates, an aircraft had a circular error probability. So when you think circular error probability, I mean, just it is exactly what it sounds like. You draw a big circle around the target, and chances are it's going to land somewhere in that circle, but you have no idea where. So for aircraft, the circular error probability is going to be between 300 and 3,000 feet. But a missile, an intercontinental ballistic missile, is going to be between 2,500 and 3,000 feet. I mean, if you miss by that much and it's a protected target, maybe it won't do any good at all. I mean, the only response to that is just to send more missiles and bombs, just to be sure. Then there is a factor that is just nuts to imagine. I mean, absolutely nuts. It's something called fratricide. This is a phenomenon where so many fireballs and mushroom clouds are occurring in the same area that incoming warheads are destroyed before they get the chance to properly detonate. The Air Force use models to figure this variable called time over target, TOT. So attacks would have to sort of be staggered. You can't have a missile destroying a SAC bomber or another missile, God forbid. Now, in the old days, is like 10 years ago, when bombs were scarce and they were big and inaccurate, the only thing you could hope to hit were large cities. But none of this would even be an option. Now, since we're looking for military and industrial targets, I mean, there are thousands of weapons instead of hundreds. There are more ground bursts, which means more dust, which means more radioactive fallout. Of course, a ground burst is a nuclear bomb or a missile that explodes after contact with the ground instead of midair. If you're hitting a target that's under the ground, like a hardened missile silo or like a command bunker or something like that, you need that shockwave to go into the earth rather than being dispersed in the air. But that's going to cause much more radioactive dust, and it's just everywhere. Curtis LeMay, however, no, that's actually good. He's going to call it, quote, bonus damage. And of course, as we mentioned before, all of these damage calculations only took into account blast, not heat, not fire, not even radiation. As we mentioned before, all of those nuclear tests, that's not something they could easily measure. Blast, we'll just stick with that and pretend everything else doesn't exist. Of course, some people are going to have complaints. Kaplan writes, quote, "From beginning to end, the SIOP sharply exaggerated the number and size of bombs needed to damage all types of targets. On November 3rd, George Kiskiakowski, chairman of Eisenhower's Science Advisory Committee, traveled to SAC headquarters for 3 days at the request of the president to be briefed on the status of the SIOP. Arleigh Burke had planted suspicions about SAC's manipulations through Eisenhower's naval aide, E.P. Arond, arousing Eisenhower to have Kiskiakowski check out the rumors. Kisti brought along one of his aides, a weapons scientist named George Rathjens, the deputy director for science and technology of the CIA, Herbert Pete Scoville. In Omaha, Rathjens looked through SAC's Atlas of Soviet Cities, searching for the town that most closely resembled Hiroshima in size and industrial concentration. When he found one that roughly matched, he asked how many bombs the PSYOP laid down on the city. The reply, one 4.5 megaton bomb and 3 more 1.1 megaton weapons in case the big bomb was a dud. The explosive yield of the atomic bomb that destroyed 1/3 of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, was a relatively puny 12.5 kilotons, end quote. Now, I realize many of you may not be math majors out there, but if you have 4 bombs and you have one 4.5 and 3 1.1s, that equals 7.8. So 7.8 megatons is 7,800 kilotons. 7,800 kilotons, divide that by 12.5. Yeah, that's 624 Hiroshima bombs dropped on this poor little town that's roughly the size of Hiroshima. I mean, what does that even look like? How could you possibly need that much? I mean, it's just so difficult to wrap your mind around. But here's the thing. This kind of thinking, this sort of overkill, it's not going to go away. I mean, it'll kind of go away for a little bit, but really until the end of the Cold War, this sort of mentality is going to be increasingly the norm. This plan, it called for the annihilation of basically the communist world. I mean, it doesn't matter that you might not have a beef with China or some Soviet satellite. I mean, everyone gets a piece. You know, I mean, you might look at this and say this is just plain murder or genocide. But then, at the same time, if you have only a moment's notice and everything is chaos, I mean, as president, you know that an incoming strike will probably sever all lines of communication with your staff. I mean, your staff might be killed or out of touch with everyone else. You're reduced to the level of a common refugee in that moment. I mean, maybe all you can do is say, unleash hell before you disappear forever. And the other thing is, everyone has one thing to do if they're caught in the war. They have one thing that they have to do. Every single person knows what they're supposed to do. Just one thing. That's all anyone will think and prepare for. I mean, if that's all there is, then it certainly is easier to prepare for than, you know, a huge array of options and possibilities. Kaplan writes this: SAC had always insisted that there be essentially one war plan, a few options to adjust for differences in the weather or various conditions of warning time, but fundamentally a single plan. Especially in the days before very fast computers, devising one war plan was difficult enough. Every detail had to be pre-planned so that bombers could hook up with in-flight refueling tankers at just the right time, go on to destroy their targets at just the right time, and return to base. In all of this, there was a phenomenon to be avoided called interference. When one plane dropped its bombs, SAC wanted to make sure that another pilot would not be flying just overhead only to be killed by the bomb's blast or blinded by the flash of the fireball. Avoiding this interference required very complicated flight paths. The timing had to be precise, down to the minute, end quote. You want to be able to look at this plan, this SIOP, and say it's just utter barbarism and it's just so inflexible. But at the same time, I mean, fighting a nuclear war there's a level of complexity to it that no one's ever seen before. I mean, you don't know how anyone is going to react under these circumstances. Your plan might be remarkably inefficient because think of all of the people involved, the amount of strain that they're going through. All of them have to know that they are involved with in a war that is just light years beyond anything that humanity's ever seen. They're involved in a genocide, and they know they're involved in a genocide, and they know that there's a very good probability that they're not going to have any home to go home to. People flying in any one of these missions have to know that, like, their odds of making it out alive probably aren't even 50-50. I mean, even if you complete your mission, do you think there's going to be an airbase for you to fly back to? I mean, you might have to pop out of that plane and parachute into what? All of this is just going through everyone's mind. The people orchestrating the attack on the ground. I mean, think of the people at that base in Omaha, off at Air Force Base. I mean, all of those people know that there are dozens of ICBMs, high-yield weapons, aimed directly at where they are. Are they going to be able to do their jobs? I've thought of this a few times. Like I have no idea. I have no idea. whether it is lunacy to have a plan like this, or maybe it's just the only thing that could ever possibly work. And then this whole idea of counterforce. I mean, counterforce is supposed to be a way to limit the damage, but I mean, what is the force that's being countered? If you are part of the command and control or in control of any of the weapons systems on either side, you're going to be even more scared because there's going to be a preemptive strike probably launched at you. You will be the first target. If you are in a missile silo, you will want to unload that silo as quickly as possible, not sit there and wait. You want to get your job done and get out. Man, it's like every time someone tries to come up with something that's going to limit the destructiveness of what a nuclear war would be, there's all of these different like corollaries of it that just make it just way more weird and deadly. And it's like one of these things that you actually really have to think through. I mean, I'm no engineer, but one thing I know is the more complex a machine, the more moving parts, the more likely it is to break down. I mean, that's what I find most interesting about is the people who have experience with war, the generals who lived through it, the ones that have seen it up close. They just don't think it can be calculated and game theoried out. But then you have these Ivy League educated, nerd egghead Rand types. They think it will all operate according to some rational principles. I mean, I don't know. I mean, personally, I find that kind of difficult to reconcile. When Kennedy comes into office in January 1961, he's going to have a Secretary of Defense named Robert McNamara. And we've met Robert McNamara very briefly. He was in on these SIOP meetings. He's going to attempt to scale back this plan for annihilation. Instead of one end of the world plan, he's going to endorse what's called a flexible response policy with a number of different options from which the president will have to choose from. There is going to be 5 categories of targets. Number 1, things like missiles, air bases, submarine pens. 2, air defense sites that are away from cities. 3, air defense sites close to cities. And then the last one, cities themselves. And the thinking is you run through the first options before citing what were going to be called counter-value targets. You have counter-force targets and counter-value targets. I think you can kind of get it. Counter-force is like taking out their ability to attack you, but a counter-value, a city, people, that's something they value. Anyway, then countries might be withheld as another options. So you would withhold maybe China if you weren't in a war with them. Maybe withhold different countries in the Soviet Eastern Bloc if you don't want to fight them. So there's going to be new missiles called the Minuteman that are going to be. These missiles can be programmed with multiple targeting options instead of just one. So they're also going to have the ability to choose in silo a ground burst or an air burst at the last minute. And I already explained to you what those are. Bombers are increasingly just seen to be as liabilities. Those are going to be phased out, not entirely, but kind of in a way. The Polaris submarines, maybe they should sort of be kept in reserve. Again, if you have these submarines and they're out in the ocean, they can just ride out any attack. And, no matter what an enemy does to you, they know that the revenge is waiting somewhere in the bottom of the ocean. Kind of a scary thought. Of course, there's always a flip side. You do all these things and you may just have to build more weapons. All those missiles and planes, they might just get blown up, everything that you reserved. You have to take that into account. I mean, even the submarines you think might be totally safe, By the 1960s, both sides have attack subs that track subs that fire the missiles. So you have attack subs. They're going to track subs that are called boomers in an attempt to sink them at the outbreak of war. If that happens, I mean, there goes your ace in the hole. What do you do? Maybe you got to build more subs. You know, you'd think that under a flexible response regime, things would get less militarized, but no. Whereas in 1960, there's going to be 8,000 megatons in the U.S. arsenal. A decade later, there's going to be nearly 17,000. I mean, it may seem like madness to us, but I mean, when you look at it up close, you do an up-close inspection, there's a very sinister logic at work. Now, right at the same time, this apocalyptic SIOP 62 comes out, and Kennedy and his boys are trying to possibly tone it down a notch, some interesting pieces of information come to light. In August 1960, the U.S. launches its own working reconnaissance satellite. Up until now, the only way to, realistically know what's going on the opposite side of the Iron Curtain are these risky U-2 spy plane flights. You've probably heard of Gary Powers. He's a very unfortunate pilot of a U-2 that gets shot down over Siberia. Those are going to come to an end. Before now, I kid you not, the Americans were using some maps that the Germans had made in World War II to tell their bombers where to fly. I mean, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, here and there, you might get a defector who might give you a valuable piece of information, but that was it. Most of the time, it was just garbage. Nobody really knew what was going on over there. Khrushchev says he's turning out missiles like sausages, or he has all these bombers and he has nowhere to park them all, but, what if he's talking out of his ass? Yes, the Soviets can put an ICBM with a satellite into orbit, but the sky is very big. It's hard to miss it, if you know what I mean. Putting that thing on a 2,000-foot circle on the other side of the planet, that's another matter. What if this missile gap is just huge overreaction fed by Soviet bluster? Khrushchev turned down every attempt Eisenhower made at this sort of open skies policy where each side would, they could do aerial surveillance on the other, kind of like a good faith measure. It's like, you show me yours, I'll show you mine. Why? What is he hiding? Better question, what isn't he hiding? Fred Kaplan writes, on August 10th, 1960, the U.S. launched the first fully successful orbit of a new strategic reconnaissance satellite called the Discoverer. Many more launches followed. The Discoverer could take photographs from outer space, and its camera was so powerful and precise that when pictures were dropped to Earth, recovered and developed, an experienced photo analyst could identify objects as small as 36 inches. The first photos were processed in November. They revealed the presence of 4 operational Soviet ICBMs at the missile testing site in Plesetsk in northern Russia. Communications intelligence and reports from spies suggested that missiles were being developed there, but the U-2 flights never had a chance to detect them. Pilot Francis Gary Powers had been on his way to Plesetsk on May 1st, 1960. Oh, man. Nikita, oh, brother. This has to be embarrassing. Honestly, if you were Khrushchev, you come to office in 1953. Technology like this doesn't exist. There's no way for the Americans to sort of figure this out. How do you know there could be a technology where from an object in space, you could take a picture of an object 36 inches and do it accurately? It's absolutely incredible. But Okay, I mean, what do you do now? So it turns out the Soviets had been bluffing the entire time. Some people at SAC they held out for months, but sooner or later they had to admit the Russians, they're not holding any cards. There were some funny staff meetings where Thomas Power was like analyzing blown up photos, and he sort of postulated that like some church steeples might actually be like camouflaged missiles. But no, I mean, even a Crimean War memorial, according to him, was like a cleverly disguised like ICBM site. At the end of the day, all they could find were 4 missiles deemed capable of hitting the continental U.S. Now, true, the Soviets had a large number of short and intermediate range missiles. They could probably endanger Western Europe or Japan, but realistically, the U.S. is out of reach for now. The missile gap is 10-1 in favor of the United States. Just 1 year earlier, the Soviets were supposedly beating the United States literally almost the same ratio, just the other way around. I mean, just look at the Gaither report. I mean, think about it. All of that firepower aimed at all of those military-industrial targets. Even if you seriously scaled back something like SIOP 62 and just dumbed it down all the way, you could just take everything out in one fell swoop. All you got to do is act. But wait, there's more. The Soviets have actually done a lousy job in hardening missile silos, meaning if they were attacked by any kind of weapon, near the ground, they would be destroyed, even if it wasn't even close. Not only that, but it would seem that they're behind in solid fuel rockets. Why is that important? Okay, so typically what's involved at this stage of Soviet missiles is liquid oxygen. This is a propellant that needs to be stored near absolute zero. They can only stay fueled on the launch pad for about 2 days, and they have to be trained. So fueling takes 24 hours. So if the U.S. struck first, these missiles will be wiped out. The U.S. Atlas, the Titan, and especially Jupiter had problems in this area, but they're kind of all being phased out once you get Minuteman missiles. So this new delivery system could be like ready to go without any time consuming refueling and with just a minimum of maintenance. I mean, most are housed in silos, but while not truly hardened, you would need a well-placed blow to knock them out. Typically, you'd have like one sort of control center, and then you would have a bunch of Minutemans sort of located miles and miles away from that one control. So you'd have one little group of officers basically, pushing the launch orders, and then the actual missiles are in different places. It wouldn't be easy to take all of that out. As for bombers, I mean, the Soviets really didn't have much going in this department. They never did. You're still looking at a few lumbering turboprop Tu-95 Bears and some M4 Bisons, and there were never anything more than like 1 to 200 of these things. If war happened between the Soviet Union and the United States in 1960, I mean, the Soviet Union would they'd get messed up like pretty badly. But the thing is, you don't have the impetus for war just yet. You don't have the pretext to launch that strike. And it's only becoming clear in like dribs and drabs that maybe the Soviets are just bluffing. Like, it's not entirely clear to the Kennedy administration. So as we're going to see in the coming year, there will be that impetus for war. And we'll see how both players in this game seek to sort of negotiate the crises that are going to come their way. Now, you look at your history textbooks, and once you get past the late 1940s, things get quiet between the great powers. The Cold War is It's kind of all about proxy wars. It's about the third world states that might drift towards the Soviet Union or the US and its allies. Here and there, you get a war that might qualify as a war, like Korea or Vietnam. But for the most part, it's this tension, the fantastical things that just might materialize, and thank God never did. Frankly, that's why I'm here talking to you, that the fact that these things didn't actually happen. The Eisenhower presidency had a lot of intrigue. He was big into covert actions. It sort of fits his model of doing things cost effectively. If there was a leader he didn't like, he would seek to undermine that leader through whatever means necessary. Just look at Iran or Guatemala. It's under his watch that the CIA really would come into its own. After leaving office, there were 3 areas of particular concern. Berlin was still what Khrushchev would call, and I mentioned this before, the quote-unquote testicles of the West. He would say every time I want to hear them, scream, I just give a squeeze. What's going on in former French Indochina? That, of course, looks like a problem. That's going to morph into Vietnam. But then there's this new one, Cuba. Back in 1959, it had fallen to a Marxist revolutionary, this Fidel Castro guy. What's his deal? I mean, nobody really knows. He appears to be a communist hardliner, but aside from that, he's kind of like a little bit opaque and cryptic. He has a very obscure background. He's definitely a wild card. Well, Kennedy gets into office, and you get the feeling that Khrushchev, he thinks that he's dealing with just a complete, total child. When he meets Kennedy just 5 months after he takes office, he's already talking about just taking over Berlin. The Western occupation zones had to go. Kennedy would say, quote, he beat the crap out of me, unquote. And he didn't use the word crap, but I'm trying to keep this podcast rating family, so you get what I'm saying. Or, quote, that was the worst day of my life. After the summit, he mentioned, quote, it'll be a cold winter. Nothing really came out of the confrontation, but Khrushchev was certainly unimpressed with his new rivalry. And the rivalry was open. Khrushchev, it seemed, felt like he was kind of coming into his own. And Kennedy at this point just sort of wants to cut his teeth. You get the feeling that both of these individuals have a level of insecurity that they're trying to rectify. I mean, Khrushchev completely must have felt like he was outclassed by someone like Dwight Eisenhower, the overall Allied commander in Western Europe. I mean, that man he had a tremendous amount of respect for him. And to go from having to deal with that to this little boy, this little rich kid, he must have felt, I don't know, just relieved. He felt that Kennedy was just sort of a person that he could push around and, I wouldn't say treat like putty in his hands, but he felt like he had sort of found his range when it came to Kennedy. Like, he knew exactly what he could do with this man. He's going to take a level of initiative that he certainly would not have done with Kennedy's predecessor. Historian Paul Johnson writes, quote, on January 7th, 1961, shortly before Kennedy assumed office, Khrushchev outlined in a speech what he called the new areas of peaceful competition between the two superpowers, national liberation wars and centers of revolutionary struggle against imperialism all over Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Kennedy took up this challenge, at any rate in rhetoric, using his inaugural as the occasion. Aiming particularly at youth, he declared the time to be an hour of maximum danger for freedom. His generation, he said, had been given the role of defending it. I do not shrink from this responsibility, he said. I welcome it. Under him, America would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to ensure the survival and success of liberty. End quote. And then at this sort of critical moment, and you kind of have to feel bad for Kennedy at this point, and Khrushchev must have been laughing all the way to the bank, but there's this propaganda victory that outshone even Sputnik. A Russian ICBM puts a man into orbit and brings him home safely afterwards. Historian Paul Johnson writes about Kennedy's reaction, and he just really doesn't know how to handle this. Quote, at a frenzied meeting Kennedy held 2 days later in the White House, he stormed, "Is there any place where we can catch them? What can we do? Can we go around the moon before them? Can we put a man on the moon before them? Can we leapfrog? If somebody can just tell me how we can catch up. Let's find somebody, anybody. I don't care if it's a janitor there. If he knows how." On April 19th, Kennedy had a 45-minute session with Johnson, followed by an excited directive the next day ordering him to find out, do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by putting a laboratory in space, or by a trip to the moon, or by a rocket to land on the moon, or a rocket to go by the moon and back with a man? Is there any other space program that promises dramatic results in which we would win? End quote. Now, meanwhile, intelligence reports blatantly showed Soviet radar was completely inadequate. No bombers were on any sort of alert. Their intermediate range ballistic missiles and their ICBMs were mostly unfueled, and few had any warheads attached. Not only that, but their air defense network was poor, and every one of their nuclear missile submarines was in port. These guys really were all bluster. The U.S. had amassed the most potent striking force in all of human history to meet this red menace, and the red menace turns out to be a Pink Panther. It's like the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. But if you can't, you see, it's like you're losing all of this stuff in public. But meanwhile, behind the scenes, you know that everything isn't sort of what it appears. But that's not what people are seeing. Kennedy just can't let things keep going the way they are. Historian John Lewis Gaddis writes, drawing on new, copious, and convincing evidence from reconnaissance satellites, he called Khrushchev's bluff. He let it be known through a spokesman that the Soviet Union's nuclear and missile capabilities had never come close to surpassing those of the United States. We have a second strike capability, which is at least as extensive as what the Soviets can deliver by striking first. Therefore, we are confident that the Soviets will not provoke a major nuclear conflict. End quote. So Kennedy is going to continue to rub it in by telling the world that the United States is pretty much aware that the Soviet Union is nothing. They're not even close to what they say they are or are capable of. On October 21st, 1961, Kennedy delivers a speech in Hot Springs, Virginia, where he reveals the number of U.S. missiles and the fact that if the Soviets were to deliver a first strike, the U.S. would still be able to destroy the Soviets. So as you can probably imagine, everyone at Strategic Air Command is watching what's going on with a very high degree of interest. RAND is performing extensive war games and analysis, and they're trying to figure out if war were to happen, how would it go down? this might be an opportunity that's just not going to come around again. Everybody's completely aware that the Soviet Union, if given the time, they're going to catch up. They're going to build the missiles and bombers and everything that they need to attack the United States, but they're not there yet. So a lot of people are saying, look, if the opportunity arises, let's just do this now. Let's get it over with. But at the same time, that's a nuclear war. I mean, that's very messy. Is it moral? So you have a lot of really difficult questions. And what's interesting is that none of this was clear to Eisenhower. Perhaps he suspected it, but those could only have been suspicions. With Truman, it was almost like the shoe was on the other foot. I mean, if the Soviets wanted to march straight to the Atlantic coast, I mean, they only needed their shoes to do so. The U.S. had only, at that point, in 1945, 2 Hiroshima-sized bombs. Good luck with that. Truman, of course, as I mentioned before, kept the size of the stockpile completely secret for a good reason. At that point, there was none. Now everything was plain as day. Satellites, they see everything. Kennedy was free to call Khrushchev's bluff, but Khrushchev knew the position he was in. There was one bright spot, though. The Soviets were still vastly superior in conventional forces in the European theater. I mean, if Kennedy wanted the war, he would need to cross this nuclear threshold. I mean, would he or wouldn't he? SIOP 62 was just waiting. I mean, he had to say the word. But still, even at this moment, even your Rand guys, it seems like they just they get cold feet. Kaufman writes this: if ever in the history of nuclear arms race, before or since, one side had the unquestionable superiority over the other, one side truly had the ability to devastate the other side's strategic forces. One side could execute the Rand counterforce no cities option with fairly high confidence. In the autumn of 1961, that was the time. Yet, approaching the height of the gravest crisis that had faced the West since the onset of the Cold War, everyone said no. End quote. Now, I think what makes you really stop in your tracks is Europe. The Soviets have hundreds of short-range and medium-range missiles. I mean, could they all be taken out in a first strike? I mean, maybe not. Western European casualties could be negligible or as high as the low tens of millions, I mean, according to intelligence. Sometimes people tell you to see the big picture. But I mean, what is the big picture? You have to think back about how easy it would have been for the Allies to strangle Hitler in the cradle when he wanted to take the Sudetenland or Czechoslovakia or even Poland. Instead, people thought about the horrors of the trenches of World War I, and they did nothing. 70 million people died in World War II, maybe more. I mean, if the Allies got together in 1938 or 39, by any estimate, you wouldn't see 1/20th of the body count. No genocide, no carpet bombing, maybe, no Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But now, in 1961, the Soviets are constantly referred to in the same breath as the Nazis. I mean, there are videos from the 1950s where an actor named Ronald Reagan is making the comparison. As we're going to see, the word appeasement is going to get leveled at Kennedy by one of the very people who helped to take Hitler down, Curtis LeMay. Kennedy is determined to show that he is not a pushover. In August, Khrushchev made a provocative move that seemed to be sort of a probe at Western resolve. I mean, you get the feeling that he's sort of searching his opponent for weakness. So he orders this construction of a barbed wire, then a permanent barrier between East and West Berlin. This is going to cause kind of a panic on the other side. What do we do? So people started thinking, maybe, the worst is at hand and we got to prepare. Historian Garrett Graff writes, quote, as the Berlin Wall rose, the Pentagon and Kennedy aide Carl Kaysen put together a serious and straightforward plan to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union, a 15-minute-long surprise attack with just 55 long-range bombers targeting 88 designated ground zeros, including 72 bomber bases and 16 ICBM facilities that would deliver a blow that Kaysen believed eliminated or paralyzed the nuclear threat to the United States sufficiently. The attack would likely kill under 1 million Russians, a manageable number that wouldn't blind the Soviet leadership with irrational urge for revenge, especially if it was coupled with a strong message to Khrushchev that the U.S. would limit follow-up attacks and avoid hitting civilian populations if the Soviets did the same. Kaysen acknowledged that the worst-case scenario for his plan included a full thermonuclear war that would kill 7 out of every 10 Americans, but that the risk might still be worth it given the escalating Berlin crisis. As he wrote, the choice may not be between go and no-go, it may be between go and SIOP 62. Kennedy received the plan, and in September, he responded with a detailed list of questions, including one in particular. If he called the Joint War Room, who would answer the phone? End quote. So in October 1961, things get very tense, and at one point, you have American and Soviet tanks sort of facing each other at a checkpoint, and that lasts for like 16 hours. Finally, it just sort of dissipates and everything blows over. But for a little while there, it seemed that it was quite possible that there could be a general war. Well, at this point, and Khrushchev, we know he's kind of an insecure man deep down. He knows that he is outgunned. Well, it's obvious what to do. What would you do? I know. Let's set off the biggest explosion in human history. Yes, that's the ticket. So, detonated on October 30th, 1961, the Tsar Bomba, as it was called, was a monster. I mean, a colossal monster. I mean, you know what? Stop the show right now, please. Just put this whole thing on pause and go watch a YouTube of it. Did you do it? Okay. What that looked like in real life? I mean, who the hell knows? I mean, it must have looked like what it would be like to see the face of God himself. I mean, not like the hold your hand, can I please have this and that God? Like, no, like the God that like opens up cracks in the ground and swallows people up. Like that kind of God. The fire and brimstone kind of guy. Khrushchev is going to ask his physicists for like 100 megaton bomb, and then he gets convinced out of it. Nonetheless, he wants to act from a position of strength, and his physicists, they fear there's going to be kind of like an ecological disaster. They kind of bring him down from, away from 100 to 50. John Lewis Gaddis writes this, quote, even so, it was large enough, the single largest blast human beings have ever detonated or have since on the planet. The flash was visible 600 miles away. The fireball was powerful and arrogant like Jupiter. It seemed to suck the whole Earth into it. The mushroom cloud rose 40 miles into the stratosphere. The island over which the explosion occurred was literally leveled, not only of snow, but also of rock, so that it looked to one observer like an immense skating rink. The entire spectacle was fantastic, unreal, supernatural. One estimate calculated on the basis of this test that if Khrushchev's full 100 megaton bomb had been used, instead, the resulting firestorm would have engulfed an area the size of the state of Maryland. End quote. Now, pulling this stunt sort of makes sense if you're Khrushchev. By all objective measures, the subterfuges that you've relied upon, basically what's holding you in power, is the ability to project Soviet prestige abroad. Now that entire image is under assault. You know that Kennedy knows that, well, the reality of your situation, but in the larger world, I mean, putting on a massive fireworks display, it makes up for a lot. The scary thing about nuclear weapons is their unlimited size. Again, I am no physicist, but I think I understand the basic premise behind the hydrogen bomb. You just need to add more fuel, the tritium and deuterium. You can make it as big as you want. That's why Rand was seriously thinking about like a gigaton bomb. It could be done. When playing from a position of weakness, in most games I can think of, the man who is down is the one that needs to take the risk. Maybe if you risk a big hand, maybe if you throw that deep pass, maybe you can pull your goalie. What Khrushchev does, it seems like it's a sort of calculus. Khrushchev is haunted by the notion of a first strike destroying his war-making ability. I mean, if not the Soviet Union altogether, the United States is, I mean, for all intents and purposes, out of reach of his missiles. His bombers aren't even worth talking about. You have to think that he's grasping for some sort of strategic solution. I mean, just look at the map of the world. I mean, it all makes sense to someone that's, played a sibling in the game of Risk. I mean, in terms of long-range ICBMs, the USSR has almost nothing to speak of by the summer of 1962. But they've had a lot of luck with their intermediate-range ballistic missile programs, the shorter-range ballistic missiles. These are the kind of missiles that travel between maybe 1 and 1,500 miles. These things can carry a payload of 1 to 3 megatons that could wipe out pretty much any city they fell on. I mean, remember our little 300 kiloton bomb from the first episode, what that did to Washington, D.C.? Yeah, I mean, think of something like 3 to 9 times as large as that. Not very pleasant. Well, now, for the past year or two, these missiles have been a threat to NATO countries in Western Europe. And also U.S. assets in East Asia and the Middle East. I mean, I think Japan, maybe Turkey. That's about it. Nothing on the U.S. mainland just yet. The Soviets are basically surrounded on all sides. It's sort of misleading if you look at their geopolitical situation using a Mercator projection of the globe. I mean, no, the world is round. I mean, on every side, from the south, bases in Turkey and Italy, the west, France, Spain, Britain, every other country there. From the north, everything that comes across the pole from North America. And then from the east, Japan. That's pretty much every ocean that you can think of. There's a Polaris missile that just might pop out of some submarine somewhere. I mean, if you're the Soviets, you are living in a state of perpetual siege. Your main adversary, the United States, although they felt otherwise, are in no such risk. Now, for the first time, you can make them aware of the fact that maybe they shouldn't feel so safe after all. Enter Cuba. There's this communist regime that you're not totally familiar with that's come to power in the past 2 years. The United States government has attempted to overthrow them, and they have failed. In April 1961, Kennedy basically took a plan that was sort of left over from the Eisenhower administration, and he launches this invasion to depose this dictator of Cuba, Fidel Castro. It just goes absolutely wrong. It's just a classic episode of indecision. He doesn't provide any sort of air support. There's this small invasion force. It lands at a place called the Bay of Pigs, and they get completely wiped out. Kennedy's sort of beside himself. Historian John Lewis Gaddis writes this, quote, Castro's troops, well prepared for the incursion, killed 114 of the invaders and took prisoner the rest, 1,189, nearly all of whom were executed or later died in Castro's prisons. Kennedy retrieved something from the press by following the advice to take responsibility for himself and publicly pointing out that had the venture succeeded, no one would have criticized it, using an excellent one-liner produced by his resourceful writers. Success has 1,000 fathers, but failure is an orphan. Actually, Ike had the last laugh, albeit a sad one. Alluding to the title of Kennedy's book, he wrote, the operation could be called a profile in timidity and indecision, end quote. Now, Khrushchev knew that Castro feared that the Yankees would take another lick. That's how Khrushchev referred to the Americans. So they throw out this rescue line. He's old enough to remember the days of the Russian Revolution. This idea of world communism, it's going to spread through this sort of a mass movement. There's this sort of idealism in Castro that he really finds sort of like appealing. And, Castro, he likes him in a sort of way. Castro is this idealist that maybe Khrushchev can sort of connect to in some sort of a deeper way. He offers to send these missiles, these intermediate range ballistic missiles to Cuba. And Castro is like, yes, done. I'll take them. So, wow, this is nuts. Think about this. Having missiles usually makes the host country a target. These guys, they're just fine with it. They're asking for them. Almost. In May, Khrushchev proposed this scheme to Castro, and then Castro accepted, and so began this Operation Anadir. In the beginning, there's a little bit of a back and forth, but Castro sort of like goes along with it. I think he's trying to play coy. Khrushchev is going to describe this as trying to put, quote, one of our hedgehogs down the American trousers, end quote. You gotta love Khrushchev for imagery. So starting in July, the Soviets are going to successfully move 43,000 combat troops, 162 nuclear warheads, as well as surface-to-air missiles, tanks, and all manner of military hardware before President Kennedy is aware of any of it. Unfortunately, Kennedy did become aware, and then everything just went haywire. So I don't want to cover the missile crisis too much, kind of like a blow-by-blow analysis, because there's so many great videos on it on YouTube. It's such a rabbit hole to go down, and I probably wouldn't do an adequate job if I were to go toe-to-toe with them. But to sum up at least the first part of this crisis in a concise manner as possible, Khrushchev is basically gambling that he can sneak enough medium-range ballistic missiles into Cuba to sort of negate the missiles arranged on his borders, pretty much on all sides. He knows that within 3 or 4 years, the Soviet ICBM program is going to reach the point that they'll be able to launch these missiles from their own country, and Cuba's not going to be so necessary. To him, it's little more than a near-term insurance policy. The Soviets are always paranoid about a U.S. first strike. To Khrushchev, he's a political risk taker, and this is just good business. Gaddis writes, the fate of Cuba and the maintenance of Soviet prestige in that part of the world preoccupied me, Khrushchev recalled. We had to think of some way of confronting America with more than words. We had to establish a tangible and effective deterrent to American interference in the Caribbean. But what exactly? The logical answer was missiles. end quote. The Soviets seem to just almost fall in love with Castro. Anastas Mikoyan, one of Khrushchev's deputies, exclaimed after meeting Castro, quote, "He's completely like us. I felt as though I had returned to my childhood," end quote. So if this were a board game, you really would have to say that's a very good move, Khrushchev. But the thing is, this plan has to go off without a hitch. The Americans cannot find out until these missiles are totally operational. I mean, but still, this is just a workaround for that ICBM problem that the Soviets have. They don't have long-range missiles. They just don't. But they have these medium-range missiles. They can go, between 1,000 and 1,500 miles. That puts Washington, D.C., maybe even New York, right in their crosshairs. The Soviets had been living underneath this sort of Damocles that was just facing them from every single direction. And now they can finally give Uncle Sam a taste of his own medicine. So the United States does find out, and there's going to be a meeting. It's called the XCOM. Basically, this series of meetings, it's this group of civilian and military advisors that was created during the Berlin crisis to sort of deal with a situation like this if it just sort of pops up out of nowhere. So unfortunately, the Hawks in this XCOM are going to dominate the early discussions. All the military advisors are going to say, let's do an invasion. At very least, they want to do an airstrike. Their advice is not unreasonable. I mean, yes, there are missiles there, but they may or may not be armed. Even if they are armed, the missiles, remember, these are liquid fueled, so it might take hours, if not days, to get them ready to fire. I mean, remember, they can only remain fueled for a day or so, and unless the Soviets had been coincidentally planning launching a first strike right at the same time, they'd be caught totally unaware. I mean, there are many opinions that typify the military stance. However, Curtis LeMay, of course, is the most hawkish. So this is some of his advice from that first meeting. Quote, "The operation is fairly simple. It would be accomplished in a few minutes. This is not without some risk. I think if we did this, we could expect our reconnaissance airplanes to be attacked from then on. And we'd probably have to follow up if we want to continue air surveillance by having to knock out the rest of the defenses. That small risk is there, but there's some risk in anything we undertake. We see no problems in doing this," end quote. Now, this kind of goes back to that problem that I mentioned about American intelligence. They have great technical intelligence. They have the best satellites, spy planes, everything like that. But boots on the ground, actual people there feeding them information, it's miserable. They don't know. So, of course, everybody knows that there are these intermediate range ballistic missiles there, and whether they're totally armed or not, that's sort of up in the air, but that's the extent of their knowledge. What they do not know is that there are well over 100 battlefield short-range nukes, and they're about the size of the Hiroshima bomb, all of them. I mean, that's a tactical nuclear weapon. So if there were to be any sort of a ground invasion, it would go nuclear. Not only that, but there are 43,000 Soviet combat troops on the island. This is not something that XCOM really knew. So Kennedy's real options, if he is to do anything at all, are a land invasion, an aerial attack, or a blockade. That last option is not something that any of his advisors thought was a good idea in the beginning, and only later did they slowly come around. So remember, Curtis LeMay is just about the most senior advisor he has at this point. I mean, this is the professional. On the 22nd, he's going to say this, quote, "I see no other solution. This blockade is a political action. I see it leading into war. I don't see any other solution for it. It will lead right into war. This is almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich. Because if this blockade comes along, their MiGs are going to fly. The IL-28s are going to fly against us. And if we are just going to gradually drift into war conditions that are at a great disadvantage to us, with missiles staring us in the face that can knock out our airfields in the southeastern portion of the United States, and if they use nuclear weapons, it's the population down there. We just drift into a war under conditions we don't like. I don't see any other solution to accept direct military intervention right now," end quote. Now put yourself in Kennedy's shoes here. I mean, you are kind of a rookie. All the professionals around you are telling you to do something that is going to lead to armed conflict. And what makes this so unbelievably dangerous is that they are operating according to the knowledge that everybody has. It's the things that people don't know that make this so unbelievably dangerous. If there are only these medium-range missiles there and nothing else, that makes perfect sense. Why sit around and wait for them to be totally operational or not? The fact that they just don't know about these short-range tactical nukes and then the 43,000 combat troops, I mean, it's just totally amazing that Kennedy is just able to stand up to these people and really stick to his guns. I mean, if he had been a weaker man, a weaker personality, or even, more decisive and strong, things would have ended up totally differently. Next time this volatile situation comes close to boiling over, both sides are on high alert. The U.S. will go to DEFCON 2, its highest level of military readiness short of full nuclear war. Kennedy confronts Castro and issues an ultimatum. That much everyone knows. Less well known is the disposition of the man in whose country these weapons are, Fidel Castro. Castro sees war coming and actually wants to fire the first shot. Meanwhile, below the waves, a Soviet submarine armed with a nuclear torpedo about the size of the Hiroshima bomb finds itself being depth-charged and gets an order to attack from its captain and senior political official. How close to the precipice can we get without falling in? It seems only a miracle is going to stop this situation from going into a full nuclear war. Then the crisis reaches its climax and then finally, through compromise, comes back down. However, the Soviets decide to outdo the U.S. in the arms race, and they seek to outbuild them. Newer, more deadly weapons are devised, including bombs that can kill a whole city with radiation without destroying any of the buildings. ICBMs that can deliver smallpox and bubonic plague to the opposite side of the world. And finally, an actual doomsday machine that can eliminate what's left of life on Earth. All that and more next time on Savage Continent.